this morning on what's really been one of the big topics, obviously, here this week is going to be the incentive auction. And there's a lot of Chairman Wheeler's been talking about it. He spoke about it at CCA and at another group that's meeting here in town this week. I won't name for CCA's sake. But I mean, he's been talking a lot about the incentive auction. His incentive auction team, I know, has been here, and I'm guessing probably has talked to some of you, and they continue to put out new documents. I think the best way to start is, why don't we, I'll just ask sort of a generic question of the whole group. And somebody has my list of questions, by the way, so if you can
we're taking pictures of them now.
Not that we're going to stick to these. These are no good.
I was just finished writing them.
Exactly. So, it was suggested that maybe a good first question to start with, and I think something everybody's trying to understand better is the pressure points for this auction, and what are the things that people are worried about, what could cause this auction to go wrong. So I think the best way to start, let's go down, we'll go down, everybody say who you are, and then just sort of address that question. And if there's anything else, I may ask follow-up questions as we go down the list. So Kathleen, let's start with you.
I have to not sit next to you.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to remind you guys that this is being recorded too. So
oh, wow. So no cuss words. I can't pull a John Ledger. Anyhow, Kathleen Ham, I'm VP for Federal Regulatory at T-Mobile, and thank you all for coming today. The question was, what could hold up the auction?
Right, and what are the pressure points? What are the biggest concerns for you?
Okay. Well, broadcaster participation is a big one, because we don't get to an auction unless we have healthy broadcaster participation. And I think that's an area where Joan and I agree. I think other areas for T-Mobile, we've filed a recon on the reserve asking to increase the size of the reserve. And I think we think that the reserve was very creative and laud the commission for doing that, but feel like there ought to be more spectrum on the reserve side than the unreserved side, because the point is to get low-band spectrum, I think, into the hands of those who don't have it to strengthen competition. Other points, I think, another real critical factor is how the reserve trigger is going to be set. And I think that's something that, yet to be determined, but that's going to be very, very important as well. So those are just a few things from my perspective.
Well, no, wait, just follow-up questions.
Okay.
You don't get off that way.
All right.
My follow-up question was, I understand that you put in a filing this morning.
Oh, yes. Yeah, thank you.
So maybe you could talk a little bit more about that. And is that essentially the same thing as what AT&T found, or what are other differences?
Well, Joan probably had the benefit of her filing, but we did a feasibility study. So we looked at, basically what is it going to take in terms of broadcaster participation to get to 84 megahertz of spectrum, which from our perspective would be a good auction. And basically our studies show that even if you take out the networks, the major networks, Univision, Telemundo, PBS stations and affiliates, that it's going to take somewhere under 400 broadcasters to participate. So basically, I think bottom line is what we filed, which took a lot of computational analysis, and I think AT&T something similar, shows you that yes, it is feasible to declare 84 megahertz of spectrum, and the broadcasters that have to show up are a reasonable number. So I think I think it was a very positive piece of work, and I think AT&T said something similar. But
this is going to be trouble. My name is Joan Marsh, and I'm Vice President for Federal Regulatory for AT&T, and this is my first CCA appearance. Thank you, Rebecca, for inviting me. I'm happy to be here because I think it's always important that we explore the areas where we can agree and work together. And even if we have disagreements, that we have, good solid discourse about them so we each understand each other's position. Although I have to say this venue is making me feel very on-hip. The question, pressure points. So I'm going to talk about pressure points from various perspectives of participants in the auction. From the wireless industry perspective, from AT&T's view, we really passed some significant milestones with the orders in May. There were multiple orders. Laid out a band plan framework and resolved some of the most contentious issues in the proceeding. And we certainly believe those issues were resolved in a fair way. We did not agree with everything, but ultimately ended up supporting it because we think there needs to be compromise on the tough issues to move this auction forward. So we supported those orders, we will continue to support those orders, and we have no interest in going back and reopening those difficult issues, which I'm sure Howard will make me talk more about in another question. The pressure points for us looking forward is continuing to refine the band plan. I think the FCC arrived at a very solid foundational framework for the band plan, but there's lots of open questions. The most significant for us is they tentatively concluded that they would permit certain unlicensed services in the duplex gap. And there are concerns within the industry, certainly with my engineering team, about whether those services will create interference into adjacent bands. So there's some complicated interference questions that we need to grapple with, and we need to grapple with the duplex gap issues from a wireless perspective. From a broadcast perspective, broadcasters who want to participate are still waiting for some key things, and the chief among them is the money issue. They want to know how much the FCC will provide them or offer them as an opening price. The chairman this morning in another venue indicated that they are going to start some very detailed outreach to the broadcast industry this fall and start to give them that information. And I think the broadcasters, to encourage broadcaster participation, I think they need to understand the economic equation. I think they need to understand that they're going to be able to participate in a very simple and straightforward way, and they are also looking for transparency. And I think all of those things would encourage greater broadcaster participation. On the other side of the equation, of course, is the NAB lawsuit. And I wrote about this a little bit. I continue to believe, in the same way the difficult competition issues that we face on the wireless side, there are difficult and contentious issues with broadcaster repacking. I continue to believe that the best way to solve those issues is not in a court of law, but through compromise, through conversation and compromise. And that's not our issue, but we want to see everybody involved in that issue to have whatever discussions they need to have and continue to pursue a compromise position if that's available, because I think that that will produce a better result than going through the DC Circuit Court of Appeals. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think that's the way it's designed.
Sorry.
I was sharing.
Right, exactly. I was just going to say, this is a good lesson for you all in sharing. Which we know the administration wants all of you to share, so that's really important. One of the things that I think has happened, that's happening today was that the chairman, the auction team is circulating an NPRM that looks at, you mentioned the duplex gap, but it looks at Part 15 and unlicensed issues. What are you hearing about that, and what are your concerns on that particular issue?
Is this on? Yes, it is. So we expect that the FCC today will circulate a series of NPRMs to resolve many of the open issues that were left unresolved with the May orders. And as you will recall, they put out a list of follow-on proceedings that they were going to pursue. The Part 15 rules for the duplex gap is certainly one of them. There's going to be questions about wireless mics, where they can live and how they can operate. There's going to be NPRM on low-power TV. And then another very important one for the wireless industry is the inter-service interference NPRM. A lot of words there, but what that means is we all need to coexist in this new band plan. The wireless industry needs to coexist peacefully with the broadcasters to the extent they remain in our channels or they are adjacent to our channels. And this last NPRM will seek to try to figure out what are the rules for that peaceful coexistence. So our attitude is this is all good news. The FCC promised that we would have these follow-on NPRMs. They have moved forward quickly to bring them to bear. They should be voted out at the meeting later this month. It'll create a lot more work for the industry, but this is exactly what we need to do to wrestle down the technical issues that we still face in the bank plan. So I'm hoping we can all work together as an industry to study these issues and hopefully come up with some consensus positions to make it easier for the FCC to move forward.
And I'm sorry, I just wanted to be clear on the duplex gap. What's the issue there? Because that's one of the important wireless issues.
So what the May order concluded in the duplex gap, of course, is the space that's between the uplink and the downlink within a band plan. What they concluded is that there should be an 11 megahertz duplex gap in the new 600 megahertz band plan. I think the industry broadly supports that. We all felt there needed to be in the neighborhood of 9 to 10 megahertz of separation, or some felt 11, to create the appropriate separation to avoid interference between the uplink and downlink. So that part of it we're fine with. What they then said that's going to happen in that 11 megahertz is 6 megahertz is going to be dedicated to a TV whitespace channel. And they tentatively concluded that 40 milliwatts would be the right power level for that service to operate at. And then an additional 4 megahertz is going to be dedicated to wireless mics. The question that's facing us now as an industry, and certainly we have significant concerns about, is whether those services, as tentatively proposed in the duplex gap, could potentially create interference into the adjacent licensed allocations. If they do, if there's interference, then those blocks that are adjacent to the duplex gap would no longer be fungible. They would be, if there's interference, they could potentially be impaired to the point that they could not be sold as the same auction product as an unimpaired block. And then you've created complexities for the auction. You've created complexities for valuation, and particularly if they're not separated and sold as a separate auction product. And that's our concern. So that NPRM will take up those issues, and I would expect there's going to be wide participation from everybody at this table and probably in this room on those issues.
Thank you. I'm sorry for doing that to you, but I just wanted to make sure we got all that. We got into that now before it sort of slipped. Okay. Next.
I am Jeff Marks. I'm Senior Counsel Director of Regulatory Affairs for Alcatel-Lucent. And I'm sorry that kept going too, because I was hoping to drill down on that exact issue. You covered it wonderfully. And so again, I mean, you know, there's concern about interference, but as far as a touch point is concerned, it's auction complexity, which is the key issue with that interference. If wireless carriers who want to bid on that spectrum aren't comfortable that all of the blocks are exactly the same, because the FCC does not intend to have people bid on specific blocks, you just bid on an amount of spectrum. And in order for that to work, people have to know what they're getting and feel like they're not gonna, oh, I might get that, you know, impaired block close to the duplex gap. Or, you know, potentially there could be concern close to the TV broadcasters. So, you know, it's always important for any auction to feel like you're going to be able to provide the services you want to provide at the quality levels you want to provide them. Here, it's even more important if they want you to feel as though you know what you're getting at auction. If you don't know what you're getting at auction, it's just going to impair the value of that spectrum. Another thing, and this on broadcaster participation, this is just a nuance on that I think is very important, is that there are large swaths of the country that are less spectrum constrained than others. And so it's not only that broadcasters participate, but we want to make sure that broadcasters participate in markets where spectrum is most constrained. And that's going to be difficult because it's in those markets that typically the spectrum's worth more. There may be fewer broadcasters that want to leave. And so education for the broadcasters and outreach to broadcasters in those markets, I think, is critical.
And from your company standpoint, I mean, those are obviously the issues that you're watching closely, but are you seeing any new issues emerge? I mean, so what are the latest things you're looking and thinking about in the auction?
So, you know, as Joan said, I think that we were particularly pleased with the report and order that it came out. I mean, we focused mostly on band plan. We wanted the band plan to create the most value for the spectrum. One of the issues we were most interested in is making sure that it earned enough value for the to pay for everything it needs to pay for, including the nationwide public safety broadband network. The chairman thinks that the AWS 3 auction is going to take care of that. We'll see. One of the things that I found interesting that went right in that order was that the duplex gap is right-sized because the Spectrum Act required that this be mostly a licensed band, and that there could be unlicensed in technically reasonable duplex gaps and blanking on the word. Guard bands. Thank you. And guard bands. One of the things that we got concerned about is they were going to be huge, and the Office of Engineering and Technology said to us, look, don't assume we're going to do the wrong thing. And so, sure enough, we think they came out with the right answer, maximizing licensed spectrum in this particular band. We like unlicensed spectrum too, but in the 600 megahertz band, we think it's best for license. You asked what we're looking at now, and it really is all of those nuances where, okay, FCC, you have created the right sizing for the duplex gap and for those guard bands, and you still want to try to put unlicensed in there. What is appropriate to go in there? FCC commissioners I've often said, well, I don't know what the next big thing is. That's why we need to have unlicensed in there. What I'm hoping is that they don't put all of the burden on the licensed wireless carriers to, the analysis says you can't put that service in the guard bands or the duplex gap, but wireless carriers, you can handle that. You can innovate to make that work. And while maybe that's the case, I don't want predictive engineering to rule here. We really kind of need certainty. So I guess it's a very related issue, but that's probably what we're going to focus on.
Okay. Jonathan, you look like you're ready to go and have some stuff to say down there. So.
I'll try, although I must say that I think that this record is replete with a long list of pressure points. I don't know how much more I can add, but I will make some comments. And first of all, I'd like to thank Rebecca Thompson and CCA for inviting myself and Jonathan Spalter, chair of Mobile Future. We represent a wide range of companies and not-for-profit organizations in the mobile and wireless ecosystem, from Alcatel-Lucent, AT&T, Verizon, Qualcomm, Cisco, to a range of smaller companies closer to where I live in the Bay Area. Very glad to be here, and thank you for having us. I think what's important to add to the concept of pressure point is that the pressure points that still exist in getting to success with the 600 megahertz auction are pressure points. These are not chokeholds. The industry has shown, I think, conclusively and well that it can coalesce around urgent national priorities, but also corporate priorities, to work very closely with the FCC in shaping a rule of order that actually has achieved, I think, the fundamental building blocks of what will be, very optimistic will be, full success in the incentive auctions. So these are pressure points. These are not lethal chokeholds that we still need to address. And these include, on the buy side, clearly the call for simplicity that you mentioned, Jeff and Joan, is critical in thinking through the final design principles, notwithstanding the reconsideration petitions that still are being worked through. I think that if we go back to even what Chairman Wheeler said this morning in his remarks, where he quoted Lincoln that we need to think anew and act anew, perhaps we need to do so with the future of the mobile ecosystem, but given the intensive and I think very prudent work that the FCC has done in shaping rule of order, we don't need to think anew and act anew with regard to the overall framework for how we move forward with the incentive auction design. We need to move forward. We need to actually make progress, and I think we will. On the sell side, I think it's a little more complex. We've heard some of the issues that broadcasters are confronting. Preston Patton frequently and well articulates them. They include the need for architectural and design simplicity, the need for greatest transparency possible, and also the show me the money principle. We need to actually be able to much more clearly articulate valuation. I think it's a very signal and important step that the FCC is taking in beginning its roadshow, not simply as the FCC presenting what those valuations might be to interested broadcasters, but because they're actually teaming up with informed people who are actually very good at undertaking fair valuation exercises with the investment bank to actually guide that process. I think that's actually going to get us a long way to the baseline of understanding of what kinds of valuations will lead to success. I think that there's also going to be a more general assessment as we move forward that the incentive auctions themselves are profoundly important, but we all know that they are only one of a mosaic of solution sets that have to more broadly address the future spectrum requirements at a moment where a company called Apple are announcing the new smart devices that are going to be smartphones with straps, new generations of their own smartphone product, and as Alcatel-Lucent and Ericsson and other companies are beginning to think about network evolution towards 5G, we have to think of the broadest possible mosaic of solution sets, including fundamentally the incentive auction, but also beyond incentive auction to include the higher bands for unlicensed, keeping a focus on freeing up more government spectrum, and all other types of technological approaches that we might be able to resort to at a future point in allaying the demand requirements that we're all going to be facing as mobile usage continues to expand at this accelerated rate here and around the world.
Thanks. I'm Ben Moncrief, Vice President of Government Relations for Spire. Just for the record, we the sixth largest wireless carrier.
One of our big takeaways, Spire is not a small carrier, it's the sixth largest. It's not as large as your two companies, but it is the sixth largest.
Words matter. We serve about 1 million subscribers. Our network covers the Memphis metropolitan area, the state of Mississippi, Mobile, Alabama, and the Florida Panhandle. To those who know well, the Panama City Beach area. So I know Joan's got an airbrush T-shirt from there. That'll make you feel more hip.
I've been in the Florida bar.
Excellent. I knew it. It's something we had. Look, I think largely everything's been said. Let me. I think there's 6 pressure points. The first 3 are NAB, NAB, and NAB. The second is recompetitions, and I don't want to steal the discussion. I certainly want to hear it for myself about where things need to wind up, and the different views of the folks on this panel with regard to T-Mobile and Sprint's recompetition. I had an opportunity yesterday when we talked, Howard, and I think things have changed. Certainly, Chairman Wheeler has got the 4 large carrier scenario. He wants 2 national, 2 metropolitan, and I think as a result of that, it's probably worth reevaluating the availability of low-band spectrum for at least 4 carriers in every market coming out of the incentive auction. And then Sprint's recompetition, which examines the question of how you should treat low-band and high-band spectrum differently with regard to the spectrum screen. I think that's also worth reevaluating. The third thing that I don't think anybody's mentioned so far is resolving the question of package bidding with PEAs and the incentive auction. Spire has altogether opposed package bidding. I think there are other folks out there on the competitive side of the ledger who have examined whether there should be some small set of large markets that may be available for package bidding. But we think that any large effort to allow package bidding risks the auction yield by carriers like us focusing on 1, 2, 3 PEAs in an area at a much higher value than somebody who might be packaging them together over a large geographic area might result in undervaluing those at auction. So we're concerned about that, and that's an open issue that still needs to be resolved.
Okay. Then let me ask you a follow-up question. I feel like, I guess my question is for the small and kind of big, but not as big as
Goldilocks.
Yeah, exactly.
That's right.
Exactly. Are we going to? How likely is it that we're going to see really active participation in the incentive auction? One of the things that's happened yesterday and today was, Chairman, we always come in with this sort of dire, warning about NAB and everything. And both Meredith Baker and Steve Berry yesterday said, our members are into work, there's going to be participation, put this spectrum up for auction and we'll go to it. And I'm just wondering, do you think that that's going to be the case with the incentive auction?
Yeah, I think that there is a pent-up demand among competitive carriers for low-band spectrum, and I think that they are looking forward to participating actively in the 600 megahertz auction. There are less of us than there were in the 700 megahertz auction, but I think that those that are here, and again, referencing a discussion yesterday, the areas that most competitive carriers serve, and then in the case of T-Mobile and Sprint as well, we don't have, in Sprint's case, really any low-band spectrum, or T-Mobile's really any that they're deployed on yet. There's going to be demand for that, and so I think they're going to be actively participating.
And one thing I've been thinking about is it possible? Is it likely that we'll see maybe more participation in the incentive auction, in the AWS 3 auction for the what I'm not going to get into it, but the non-big four carriers, just because it seems like it's easier in a way because you don't have the same clearance issues, and also there's so much of a desire for low-band versus mid-band spectrum.
It's tough to tell. I think that the analysis carriers like us and smaller will go through is if they're, and many of them have limited resources available, I'm sure they would prefer to spend those on low-band spectrum than either.
Okay. Now this is a question for the group, and it's already been discussed a couple of times, but and NAB has emerged as a new kind of bad word in the language for us. A new swear word, and
NAB backwards.
exactly. The thing that I've been wondering about is the extent to which this is a real threat to the auction, or is this just one of those things where everything's going to kind of get worked out and it's just a little blip in the road, but it probably won't mean a much later auction than what's been predicted. So if you want to, you haven't spoken for a while, Kathleen, so I know that something will start with you.
Well, litigation is litigation. I mean, you have to address it. I go back to my days when I used to run the spectrum auctions program at the FCC, and we always had litigation around auctions, and so it kind of, you roll with the punches with that. And I think the question will be, whether NAB's arguments, are enough to sort of stop the auction in its tracks. And they've been granted an expedited appeal, which is good. And the FCC, I think, feels pretty confident in their position. If we could all sing Kumbaya and get along and get, I think that would be great. I tend to be skeptical that NAB really wants to sing Kumbaya and that they'll really, in the end of the day, because, not many associations like to lose members. And and this is really about NAB losing some membership. And so whether or not, in the end of the day, they can be supportive, even if some compromises are made. And some of the things, the litigation, as I understand it, has to do with, it's focusing on this OET Bulletin 69 primarily, which is what sets the sort of repacking contours for the broadcasters. And they're worried about losing eyeballs based on the Commission's update of that, which included things like going from the 2010 census data to 1990 census data. Well, a lot has happened since 1990, and so whether that meets the statute, and I think the language of the statute says something like, the Commission has to use all reasonable efforts to try to maintain eyeballs for the broadcasters, and it cites to this bulletin. The question is what constitutes reasonable efforts, and is it reasonable for the Commission to use a more recent census report, is it reasonable for the commission to upgrade its software? I mean, the stuff that was being used is Fortran technology. Some of you guys, I mean, I don't think it even exists anymore. So the commission is trying in a very complicated auction where they're going to have to compute and do sort of real-time evaluation. They are trying to upgrade this OET Bulletin 69 in, I think, a reasonable way. And I will say that an area where the courts tend to give the FCC a lot of deference is in their technical expertise. So, you know, we'll see what comes of it. And again, if something could be worked out, that's great. But I'm skeptical that NAB is really looking for that in the end. Sorry.
What about your perspective going beyond the blog post from April 2 weeks ago?
So I guess my perspective on this is it's not a roadblock. And there's a lot of work that we need to accomplish while the litigation is pending. I agree with Kathleen, litigation needs to be dealt with, and it's not uncommon to see it in a complicated auction proceeding like this. There's a lot of work that we need to contend with while the litigation is pending. See the 4 NPRMs being circulated today, or maybe more, it might be 5. They have asked for and will be given expedited treatment. Both sides have agreed and want to see this resolved as quickly as possible. And at the end of the day, as important as these issues are for NAB, for the reasons Kathleen identified, they don't necessarily, I don't think it's good for a long delay for NAB either. This is out there. All the broadcasters have to contend with it. Those that do not want to participate or think they don't want to participate, it's sort of an overhang on their business. So I think it is in their best interest as well to move this litigation forward. So I'm going to continue to view it as a detour, not a roadblock. And I think I'm more bullish and optimistic than Kathleen that hopefully aspects of the appeal at least could be worked out. Because on complicated issues like this, I think the best solutions would be found at the commission, not in a court of law.
And you know, I do want to stress, because I think people get a little confused on what it means legally to file an appeal. You know, the expedited treatment's great and everything, but if it wasn't expedited and everything dragged out, the auction would happen. So, you know, by filing the appeal, that, you know, you have to deal with it, and it's going, the briefing schedule is going to, you know, make it so that it could be resolved by the time of the auction. But it really is on NAB to prove what they want to prove. It's really on NAB if everything isn't tied up to get a stay, if it wasn't resolved. So there's, they have an uphill battle, not the least of which is the fact that for a court to decide to put itself in the place of the FCC on what OET 69 should look like is unlikely. So for those reasons, I do think it's a blip. I do also think, you know, it is reasonable if anybody really thinks that its members that are going to remain in the market are going to be harmed, that they want to fight this. You know, I mean, you know, looked at the best light for them. This was their chance to try. So, but in the end, I don't think it's going to stand up.
Anybody else want to venture a comment, or we can move on? There's a lot of stuff to cover. Well, that being said, I guess I wanted to. I mean, this is Vegas and everything, right? So, and the odds makers have put they'll put odds on everything, but there are no regulatory odds makers other than people who lobby the FCC, as I understand it. None of the casinos will give you odds on the over/under for when we're going to actually see an incentive auction. But with all the different factors right now, I was kind of fascinated to get everybody's best guess about whether we're actually going to see an auction in mid-2015, which is still what the FCC is saying, although they do seem to, Chairman Wood does seem to be preparing everybody that it might be a little later now. So I just wonder, from your perspective, when are we going to actually see this thing take place?
I'll take a crack at the crystal ball gazing. So there is a lot of, not just crystal ball gazing, but calendar gazing going on. I'm not only optimistic, but I think it will be precedentially important for Chairman Wheeler to try to keep as best he can in the Commission's efforts focused on actually achieving the targets that actually have been publicly made. Q3, Q4, 2015 are achievable dates. I'm reminded, actually, having at an earlier stage of my life, having served in the federal government at the Pentagon, that it took, when there was a moment of national urgency, exactly 5 years for the Pentagon, which remains the world's largest office building, to be built. Surely this commission, given its focus, given its sense of urgency and the commonality of interest it's been able to elicit from so many stakeholders in this process, will be able to achieve reasonably the goals that have been set forth in the public record. If there's slippage, and which I hope there will not be, it will be for technical, not strategic reasons. But the calendar is before us, and I think it's in everybody's interest that there be clarity and a sense of precision about meeting the goal of getting this done in 2015.
I'm reminded of that night when Fred Barnes, I think, declared that McCain would be a winner over Obama in a walk. And yet he's still on TV, so I'll go ahead and make a guess. I think a few months of perhaps delay as a result of this litigation. I mean, it's litigation; it takes time, even though it's on an expedited schedule. But I don't anticipate seeing this go into the following year, 2016.
So maybe even like November, maybe even a year after AWS 3, that would be pretty reasonable timing.
Yeah, well, from T-Mobile's perspective, I mean, we'd like to see it stay on track as much as possible. And some of the stuff, I mean, we're talking about NAB litigation, there could be other litigation, so we'll just have to see. But the commission is certainly lining things up. You know, as Joan referenced, they have all these items on the upcoming meeting, and they're doing everything that they can to keep things on track. And so they're certainly motivated in that direction, and that's great.
Let me just add, when they were going to issue the order last spring, they held firm to the fact that there would be an order, it would be a complete order, and then they started talking about it would be a framework. And so I'm not sure whether the FCC itself anticipated having 4 follow-on proceedings starting this fall a year ago or a year and a half ago. And so this is really complex stuff. I agree. I think they should try to stay on schedule. But the thought of it sliding, later in the year, I think is very possible because these are really hard issues.
Yeah, I would just also add, don't forget there's a lot of work that happens after the auction. So, we got to get to the auction so we can get to that other part. And the one thing about Spectrum these days, whether it's AWS or it's this Spectrum, none of it's clear, and there's a lot of work to be done after the fact. So, bringing the Spectrum to market is a long-term effort. And so the sooner we can get going on that, the better.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's 39-month transition period, I think, was right to the order after the auction closes. So, I mean, we're not going to be, it's a watch, by the way, Apple. It's a watch that they debuted today. Nobody's going to be having a watch running on 600 megahertz for several years. So it is important to get the thing closed so that we can begin the process of deploying it as well.
Let's talk a little bit about license sizes was a big issue. And ultimately, Kathleen, maybe you want to explain the PEAs and what or Ps, whatever.
Virtual economic areas.
And any way you say it, it's not exactly a smooth term. But
and we want
explain that.
Peace in our lifetime.
I want to get a sense of whether everybody's comfortable with that, especially Joan from AT&T. Are you guys now comfortable with that license size? Because I know it's not what you asked for.
Well, from T-Mobile's perspective, we're fine with where they ended up. I think the commission was trying to be creative and do sort of a hybrid of the EA and some of the smaller areas, in particular for the rural carriers. And I know a lot of rural carriers wanted CMAs, but there's just too many CMAs, I think, to basically compute in an auction this complex. And so I think the commission was trying to find a sort of hybrid solution. And how many Ps are there? There's 400 something.
418.
Yeah, so I think that they felt that that was doable.
That's still a lot of licenses. That's still a lot of licenses that way.
Yeah, it is, but I think it rolls up, you know, in some of the larger markets to more like an EA type bidding. So I think it was a good compromise from our perspective.
So from our perspective, we certainly supported the basic EA economic area, the larger license area, and agree with the CMAs that just we need to move on from CMAs. They don't make sense anymore for modern wireless technology. You know, we engaged in the conversation with Ps. We appreciated the fact that EAs sometimes grouped rural and urban areas in a way that was not conducive to smaller and more rural carriers being able to fill out their footprint. So we appreciated all that. We engaged in the P conversation, and we kind of came to the conclusion of we're fine with Ps because Ps will nest into EAs, so there will be some symmetry available, but we asked for package bidding. As Ben indicated, the package bidding question is not yet resolved. I am not optimistic it will be resolved in our favor. I'll be very honest there. The FCC doesn't seem inclined to go the package bidding route. So the license size is less important to us if we can do rational package bidding. If we can't do rational package bidding, you've got 400 different auction, 400, what'd you say, Ben, 412?
418.
Yeah, 418 separate auction products and potentially 418 separate clocks ticking, and it's going to introduce a lot of complexity, and we'll have to deal with it.
Howard, thank you for reminding us to mind our P's and Q's. But I would just make a point. You know, I would agree with Joan about aligning with the general comfort with the level of the P's that have been elaborated, but it is a basic principle of network design and engineering. The larger geographic areas lend themselves to more efficient network builds. And that just has to be a principle that we have to keep in mind, not only as we're evaluating EAs and Ps within this auction design process, but also for future ones.
And isn't there a possibility that the FCC will allow the aggregation of a group of Ps to create a super P? So that didn't sound as bad on paper.
That would be a genetically modified.
They're being recorded.
But unfortunately, this one's not on the web. So
I'd be happy to buy a Super P t-shirt if there's one available out there.
Super P. So I wanted to. Is there any speculation on that? And any thoughts on that? Because those were the questions that get suggested for those accounts.
Yes, there is speculation on that, but I think Joan has some intel. I have some intel. I don't know where they're headed.
No, I haven't heard about the Super Ps, but like I said, we'd be interested, and I'd buy a t-shirt. That is, in essence, that's what our package bidding proposal was. Is if you have disaggregated license and licenses like Ps, and they roll up into an EA, then a company like AT&T should be able to come in and say, we would like this group of Ps that represents this EA, and we should be able to submit an aggregate bid for that group of Ps, and then all the individual bidders can bid individual Ps, and where the greatest value is, that's who's the provisional winner of that round of the licenses. So we had a very, I think, a fairly straightforward package bidding proposal that would permit package bidding on aggregate, but it would not in any way exclude bidding on the disaggregate as well. And that's, I believe, is still on the table. It certainly hasn't been rejected, but the FCC has certainly indicated that at this point they're not inclined to go down the package bidding route.
Now, I really hate going to panels where the moderator doesn't ask for questions from the audience. So I wanted to see if anybody has any questions, and I wanted to wrap up with maybe a big question or two for the whole group. So do we have any questions from the audience back there? There's no microphone, right?
Shout.
Just shout. Shout. It's not that big.
Fair enough. So the fungibility, going back to the question that you were asking, I'm still, maybe you guys can add a little clarity in terms of, so you have an auction, everything's fungible, you buy basically a block, and then how does the allocation occur after that? Is there actually going to be like a secondary auction? Another round in essence, a bonus round that you in essence end up paying more for the blocks that you actually want? Because I imagine aggregation is also kind of an important point for the people on the stage.
Extremely important point, very unresolved at this point. So theoretically, let's take an 84 megahertz band plan that would produce 7 blocks, and let's assume they're all fungible. So no particular block is more impaired or less impaired than the other. The bidders would just express a demand. And coming out of the initial round, if AT&T had a demand of 2 blocks, we just won 2 blocks. We don't know which 2 blocks that we won. And that's why this question of interference, particularly into some blocks and not others, is so important. There will be subsequent, then once, if the auction successfully closes, there will be an assignment round. So in the assignment round, that's when the FCC says, AT&T, you won 2 blocks, and you won these 2 blocks, and we are able to, or the FCC identifies which blocks we won. It is unclear how that assignment round will be conducted. It's unclear, at least to me right now, whether it be revenue neutral or not revenue neutral. Whether we might have to bring a second pot of money to the table to say, we want those 2, but we don't want those 2. And the less fungibility that exists between the blocks, the more important potentially that assignment round could become. Because let's say in the 7 block scenario again, 3 of the blocks are subject to some impairments and 4 of the blocks are very clear. You could imagine everybody in the auction is going to express a preference for the 4 clear blocks. And so how much valuation would we have to attach to that? What kind of capital we would have to bring that assignment round? That's an unknown at this point. That set of rules will have to be worked out and will be worked out in one of the follow-on procedures that the FCC is setting up.
Yeah. And another potential approach I think that was discussed was identifying whether there were any blocks that are impaired and setting those aside to be auctioned separately. So you have fungibility among the impaired block or blocks and then fungibility among the rest.
But that still doesn't get to the question of aggregation, which I imagine is fairly important. Or is it?
Do you mean if you to have 10 consecutive, 10
larger
10
block sizes to allow for faster speed of, user experiences? I imagine, you can carry aggregation, you can do it, but
no, but the FCC is intending to let people who bid on 2 5 megahertz blocks to be adjacent.
I don't think that I think you'll see auction rules around that as well, and I can't think of a single reason why the FCC would say to a bidder that 1 2 blocks, we're going to separate them. So I think you're going to see a preference for band aggregation, to great contiguity, and probably even geographic contiguity, which is more complicated because you're going to have sort of more fragmented bidding. But I think you're going to see the assignment rules favor those. But still, even if you can get 2 blocks together on the 7 block run, how are you going to get these 2 blocks or these 2 blocks is still an open question.
Has the FCC indicated at all when they're going to be providing clarity? That must be one of the follow.
Yes.
That's one of the NPRs still. There's quite a few actually. So.
Yes, I would expect that would be to be resolved in one of the follow-on NPRMs.
Because you need clarity you would want clarity for a while before the auction, right?
Well, the question of the assignment round, whether it's going to be revenue neutral or not, is essential. In terms of valuation, in terms of how you spend your capital, you need to know whether you need to bring capital to that second auction, so to speak, if you want to call it an auction. Do you need to bring capital to the assignment round or don't you? So there's very specific rules for that I think are going to be really important to the wireless industry.
The only other thing I would add is that how you define what's impaired is also an issue that's unresolved. So the definition of impairment, some people might be willing to take a license that's, 20% impaired with, but how the commission defines that I think is also important.
So, and just I think this is a really important point too, in a lesson from 700 megahertz. So in 700 megahertz we had A block licenses that were the equivalent of the B block licenses, but the A block licenses sold for 50% of the value, roughly, because there were some impairments associated with that. So if the FCC can define the impairments, we can value it and we can buy the product. But we need the clarity of the definition to assign the valuation and be able to have a credible auction strategy.
Some may disagree about the causal relationship about the valuation.
I guess, but the FCC has put a lot of emphasis on the idea that these blocks are going to be completely fungible. And you're saying that there's probably no way they're going to be completely fungible, right?
Well, you know, for example, this item that's going up this month on inter-service interference, right, has to do with adjacent channel interference. And so, you know, to the extent we coexist, if you happen to get a block that's going to be next door to a broadcaster, you may have to tolerate more interference than somebody else. So those are the sorts of things that, you know, I think are still in play, and the Commission has to resolve all that. Just in general, you know, the more information you have in an auction, the better, you know, is going to be for valuation and rational bidding in the auction.
Well, and I just wanted to add too, there are going to be some, if let's say that all the blocks really are fungible, just purely fungible blocks, who you are and what other holdings you have can make a difference in engineering as far as what fits best with your network. So it can be a very carrier-to-carrier question about what's ideal for you. And you and another carrier may agree that, well, that's better for you and this one's better for me. And that may have to be worked out as well.
Well, that was obviously a very good question, so thank you. Do we have another really, really good question? Super question.
Super, yeah, super.
Paul, you're being awfully quiet.
And
you fall into the category of not kicking the sleeping dog.
My super PT shirt.
You can make money.
Did you have a question, Paul?
I guess not.
Well, congratulations, you've satisfied all the questions.
Complete clarity on the auction.
There's one over here.
Yes.
There you go.
Rebecca.
You talked about pressure points. One of the things I'll dug down on enough is reserve trigger. And I'm curious for your thoughts on whether the reserve trigger is a good idea, how it's going to impact the reserve itself if it leaks in. I know AT&T, you guys make filing in May right around 10 quarters about the structure of that. So just Helen's thoughts on the reserve trigger broadly.
Here's where we have fun. Well, no, on the reserve trigger, you know, we have concerns. First of all, we have no problem with, you know, you need enough money to repack, you need enough money to get them to exit the broadcasters, you need enough money for FirstNet. And so, assuming you hit those targets, you're raising a good amount of money, and whether the Commission needs to set some sort of megahertz pop trigger on top of that is something we question. And I think, you know, the Commission doesn't, you know, they're very good people there, but it's hard sometimes to get that number right. And when they've gotten it wrong, they haven't necessarily raised the amount of money that they've wanted to raise. An example of that is the H Block auction. And when they've gotten it right, that is, they've set that reserve very low, they've actually had like auction 66, they've had a very fruitful auction. So I think, you know, we have some concerns about the megahertz pop trigger, and whether there needs to be one, and if there does, ensuring that is not set in an arbitrarily high manner, because then, you know, the reserve doesn't kick in. And I think for all the reasons that I think the Commission wanted to promote competition and make that reserve available to competitive carriers, you know, we think that that's critical that not be set too high. And this is where we're going to disagree. So.
But we may not disagree as much as Howard wants us to disagree. So the reserve, the idea behind the reserve is that the FCC, and a lot of things would kick in once the reserve is reached, not the least of which are the restrictions, the set-asides and the reserve and non-reserve pools. The idea behind setting a reserve is to make sure that the auction is nominally successful, however we want to define that, before these other things kick in. And I think the second thing the FCC wants to do is remember this is a clock auction. People are bidding demand, not price. And so the FCC wants to make sure that I believe that there's not a situation where some markets are selling artificially low. but we're still at a level of success. So they've effectively left money on the table. And that's the complexity that that's being faced here, is the notion that it is a clock auction, which is a demand auction, the fact that there is a relative market price. I agree with Kathleen, when you start trying to set that, it's very difficult, fraught with peril, but there is arguably, based on history and what Spectrum is trading at, some sort of market price that you would imagine would attach. And that market price is going to look different in New York than it's going to look in Peoria. And they want to make sure that everybody's all in. All bidders are all in until they've reached some level of success. And I believe that that is essential, because I think all bidders are going to need to be all in to get this done. It's going to cost a lot of money to close this auction. And they've got to keep all bidders at the table, all in, until they reach some level of success to get this done. So we supported what they had tentatively concluded about the reserve, which is all of the revenue targets will have to be met before the specific set-asides kick in, the competition set-asides kick in. We support that. We think that's the right direction. I honestly don't know where they're going to go on the issue that Kathleen raised about specific megahertz per pops reserve per market. I'm going to remain open-minded on that, because this is a really complicated endeavor that they've undertaken here. And there's going to be a lot of moving parts that have to come together for this auction to be successful.
We have time for one more question from the audience, or otherwise ask I'll ask a couple more quick questions and then we can wrap up.
Yes, since we're in Vegas, one more predictive question, and that is, when is, what's the expectation for when this spectrum is really going to be available and useful for, for carriers in the real world?
Well, I think it's going to depend. It's going to be very market specific. I mean, there are parts of the country where I don't think, there are many broadcasters. I mean, there'll be parts of the country that will be available pretty quickly. There'll be other parts that, there is this 39-month timeline that Ben referenced that the broadcasters have. And sometimes timelines can be expedited. Certainly that was our experience with the AWS ban. The government had like 7 years by law to hang out, and we got them off in 2. So, but the 39 months is, I think, what the commission's setting out there is the goal.
Yeah, and I think the gating factor behind the 39 months is they have to repack all these broadcasters. So they're all going to have to retune. And I'm not in the broadcast industry. I don't understand how difficult that is. But I've seen wildly disparate estimates about how long it's going to take, how many are going to have to be repacked, how much time that's going to take, the fact there's not enough personnel out in the field to do all these retunings. And I don't know the answer to that. But certainly the target is all of them that need to be repacked would be so within 39 months. And I think during that time period, we of course will be working to standardize the spectrum, to work with our equipment vendors, to work out equipment, et cetera. So we're ready to roll as soon as it's clear. But you'll probably see, like Kathleen said, phased clearing in different markets over time.
And I would just say that does raise the broader policy point that while full implementation of utility and spectrum auction, while we're waiting the 39 months for packing, potentially more, the need for flexible, fluid, and speedy secondary market transaction reviews doesn't go away. And in this interstices, while we're waiting deployment of auction spectrum, this is even going to be more important, particularly as demand continues to spike.
Interstices is strong.
I'm impressed.
Ask Qualcomm would be my answer. They'll tell you when it'll be ready for deployment. And my second prediction will be it'll come to market faster than 700 megahertz H Block data.
There's a gamble.
Bold, man.
Bold.
Hopefully it won't be as hard.
This is on tape. We're going to hold to that.
Well, so let me then, I guess we probably time to close up because we're getting to that 11:30 hour, and I think this has been a very productive discussion, and I really like all the discussion. To me, it strikes me that there's just so many big issues, and there's so many variables here, and there's so many unknowns, and there's a lot of stuff that we don't even know because the FCC is still working through it. It seems like there's been alternately a lot of optimism and pessimism about the auction, but I was wondering I wanted to ask everybody, are you more optimistic or pessimistic than you were, say, a year ago, that this is going to be a successful auction? And then secondarily, how do you define success? So that was on the questions that we...
that was one of, I think that's one of the few.
I've never seen that question before.
Yeah. Well, I think, how do you define success? I think you define it with, at least from our perspective, at least 84 megahertz of spectrum made available nationwide in this auction. So you have to have healthy broadcaster participation, and that is something that I think the Commission and the industry has to tackle. That other industry association that's having an event down the road has hired a broadcaster ambassador, for example, somebody that they want to do some outreach to broadcasters. And I think there's a lot of education that has to happen there. I think it is the industry engaging and proving that we're interested in this spectrum, talking about our interest in this spectrum, what was that line from the money? Show me the money. It's, I think, something that the broadcasters are going to need to hear more of as we move along.
So are you more or less optimistic?
Yeah, I'm very optimistic. I mean, I think the Commission is doing a lot of good work. They're moving forward on this. They're committed. And so I think that's a big deal. And I know it's complicated, and it's the most complicated auction the Commission has ever done, but, you know, I go back to when the Commission did, you know, the simultaneous multiple round auction. They were doing internet auctions way before there was eBay, you know. And that was all new back then and so forth. So I think you got a really smart team at the Commission, a lot of really good people behind this, and I think they're going to move it along, so I'm optimistic.
This is the proverbial my bank billiard shot with one stroke of the cue to get it right. It's tough, but I'm optimistic that it is going to happen. It's going to be done effectively. What is success? Well, I think ultimately, again, at the higher policy level, success will be when President Obama's moonshot goal that he established in the well of Congress and State of the Union that 98% of all Americans will have access to high-speed broadband will be true and significantly made true by participation of the mobile ecosystem. In more brass tacks, what is going to be success? Success will be not just when the broadcasters see true incentive to participate, but it will be when 4 national carriers and significant numbers of competitive carriers, all who wish to participate, will be able to walk away from this auction feeling that they were actually able to get good valuation and good results for their participation. Ultimately, though, success in the longest term vision is what Chairman Wheeler said this morning. If we get the architectural and design principles right for this specific incentive auction, it will become the template around which we're going to be able to coalesce and conduct auctions going forward into the future. So the magnitude of the opportunity here isn't simply the ability to provision more Americans with this extremely valuable electromagnetic spectrum. It will be the FCC's ability to show that it can and has worked productively with the broadest range of stakeholders, including a very willing mobile industry, to step up and structure an architecture for the future of how we're actually going to be managing spectrum going forward for generations.
Yeah, I don't know that I'm especially more optimistic. I was relatively optimistic a year ago, given the immense dedication that the chairman pointed towards this auction. It's, you know, clearly a cornerstone of what he hopes to accomplish during his tenure as chairman, and so I'm still optimistic, I guess is the right answer there. In terms of success, you know, for us and for the competitive industry as a whole, I think the important thing to happen, obviously a lot of things to be resolved, a lot of open issues still, but at the end of the day, that at least 4 carriers in every market walk away with sufficient usable spectrum, low-band spectrum, in order to enhance competition in every market in the U.S.
Last word.
The point is to
So, I'm actually more optimistic. I think that before I mentioned that the FCC, some of the staff indicated that they were going to have a single order that was going to take care of everything, and it was going to be last spring. I'm actually glad that we're diving in to these very hard issues separately, and that we have a framework. I think that it was a smart way to do it, and it gives people some things locked in place in this most complex auction ever held anywhere in the world. I think to have some targets that aren't moving, and to now address these unlicensed and other inter-service interference issues, I think are very important. I think it's a good step. The people have also addressed what would we call success, and I do want to come back to that. I do think that success is not just hitting a target in most, what the target is in most of the country where markets are constrained, where there's less need for spectrum, but hitting a goal of a reasonable number of blocks of spectrum in places like New York, Chicago, some of the harder to, the places where spectrum is needed most.
So I will be the first to confess that when the legislation that launched the incentive auction passed and I read it, I went, no way, this is just too hard. My optimism was at a very low level at that point. But at each critical stage along the way, first when the NPRM released, and there was a really well done white paper attached to the NPRM from the auctionomics team that explained what a clock auction was and explained how these mechanisms could work, my optimism rose. And I think at each major milestone along the way, including the orders in May, which made it very, very clear that the FCC team is grappling with these issues, that they are finding solutions, that they are moving forward on an iterative basis, I think my optimism has continued to rise. So I would say more optimistic because of the progress that has been made, the real progress, the very difficult issues that have been beaten down. We have more in front of us, but the FCC has beaten down some pretty difficult issues. And finally, I think I'm optimistic because we need to be. And I think Chairman Wheeler said this morning, there's not that many opportunities out there. There's certainly not easy, low-hanging fruit left in the spectrum policy world. We need to be optimistic because this is the next big chunk of spectrum, big band of spectrum that's going to be available for the wireless industry. This could become our 5G spectrum. We don't know what 5G is, but we know it's going to come, and when it comes, we're going to need a spectrum home for it. So this could be the spectrum that the wireless industry uses to bring 5G to the world. So we need to be optimistic, we need to keep working, we need to stay at the table with all the stakeholders, and we need to make this work.
Well, thanks to all the panelists, thank you all for coming.
Get back to the original